You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Today, Mr. Jim McCafferty, who his name is on the cover of these books that he's written, like The Bear Hunter, Hunting Bear and Panther in the Old South, and this one, Bird Dog Man, the story of W.W. Titus. You need to tune in to this episode with Jim McCafferty here on the show.
Mississippi Outdoors is sponsored by Entergy Mississippi. Entergy is building a stronger and cleaner grid to power a brighter future and protect our great outdoors for generations to come.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. If you like stories, especially stories about maybe from a long time ago, hunting, fishing in Mississippi and areas around Mississippi, you're in luck. Today is your show. Mr. Jim McCafferty, author, and I guess by default, a little bit of a historian as well as it comes to hunting in Mississippi, right?
Well, a little bit of one.
So, Jim, first of all, thanks for coming. A pleasure to meet you.
Thank you for having me here, Matt.
Take me back as we kind of build up to, I got a stack of books and I got some questions about those subjects. But your history as it pertains to Mississippi, you're from here, born here, kind of take me back to the beginnings.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot to tell because I've been here for a long time. But I was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. My father was a Methodist preacher, and we moved from Tupelo to Marks when I was about a year and a half old down in the Delta. That's where I had my first Delta experience. It was the first time I went out in the woods and really went fishing, I guess, was in Marks. And then we moved back up to the hills, moved up to Iuka. Was there for a couple of years, started school up there. Then we moved back to the Delta, Clarksdale, for 4 years in Clarksdale. That's where I really got the seeds planted for my Bobo book we'll be talking about later.
Yeah.
And then we moved from there to Leland, lived there for 5 years until I finished the 10th grade. And at that point, we moved back up to northeast Mississippi to New Albany and finished high school up there and ended up going to Millsaps College here in Jackson. And I've been, except for 3 years up at Ole Miss in law school, I've been down in this part of the state since then. I live in Macomb right now.
Right. I think a lot of listeners are doing what I was doing as you were talking. So I'm connecting the dots and thinking, okay, in the first 20 or so years of your life, you covered a lot of ground.
I did.
Literally and figuratively here in the state of Mississippi, didn't you?
I did. And I really am glad I had that opportunity because, Northeast Mississippi and the Delta they're very different parts of the state, but they're very unique in their own rights. And I really enjoyed living both places and love both areas dearly.
Mm-hmm. So as you were practicing law over the years, how did you fit in this side career as an outdoor writer and photographer? And I mean, to the point that an award-winning career as an outdoor writer, how does that also run parallel with as an attorney?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. They didn't run very well together parallel. I quit law practice for several years and quit working in the legal field for several years to devote to writing and photography. And I'll tell you, anybody who makes a really good living at outdoor writing, back then particularly, I have no idea what it's like now to be an outdoor magazine writer. It's very different now, different landscape. But anybody who had really made a good living back then would have probably been a multimillionaire at anything else because it pays low. But I did okay. I made a living. Sold to magazines. I had a self-syndicated newspaper column around the state for a number of years. But when my wife was expecting our second child, we decided it was best that she just come home and stay with the children, and I would go back and get a real job. And that's when we moved back to Jackson. We were living up in Oxford at the time. Yeah. And we moved back down. We moved to Jackson then, and she had a full-time job at home with the children because we ended up having 5. So,
oh wow!
So I practiced law and went out on my own practicing law 30 years ago, and I'm basically semi-retired from the law practice now. And all I do is write now.
Okay,
and I'm really happy about that.
Yeah. So would you say? I mean, is it fair to say law was work and the outdoors was your passion.
That's right. Law was the way I paid the bills, paid the school tuition, all of that, And now that I just wrote my last tuition check a few weeks ago, and my youngest has finished her schooling, so
That's great.
now I don't have to write tuition checks anymore. I can just I can write books.
Yeah. All right. And speaking of books, when was the first one? When did that come along? What was kind of the genesis of, I'm going to write a book?
Well, I've got two that you don't know about.
Okay.
Probably. I actually wrote two children's books back in the late 80s.
Really?
And they were both about Holt Collier, the bear hunter.
Yeah.
And one was called Holt and the Teddy Bear. It was a story about how the teddy bear got its name. And the other was called Holt and the Cowboys, which is a really interesting story, I think, about the time Holt Collier was out west working on a ranch for a while. But at any rate, those books were published by Pelican Publishing Company, and they went out of print. And I just got the rights back, and I'm going to self-publish them, hopefully within the year.
That's great.
But you're talking about the books that are sitting in front of you.
Right. And one of them especially, got my attention.
Right. The Bear Hunter.
The Bear Hunter.
Right. The Bear Hunter. Well, it starts, my interest in the Bear Hunter starts before I really knew much about him. When I was in the 5th grade, I had a friend named Jack Bobo. We were both in the same class. And I remember him telling me about his great-great-grandfather who hunted bear. In fact, he told me they still had the rifle he hunted with. Okay. And that stayed in my mind for years.
And I'm interrupting, but at that time, that would have been, his great-grandfather would have been.
It's his great-great-grandfather.
Great. So mid-19th century.
Yeah, we're talking about his great-great-grandfather was Robert Eager Bobo.
Okay.
And called Bob. And or some of his friends called him Rob sometimes, but he was mostly known as Bob. He was born in 1847, and his heyday was in the 1880s and 90s. But I didn't think about that for a long time. We moved down to Leland, and I heard more stories about bear, bear and panther and wolves, that sort of thing. There were always stories. I was very envious of my friends whose parents were in hunting clubs behind the levee, because back then, this was in the 1960s, outside the levee, you almost never even saw a deer track, much less a deer. Mm-hmm. And I can remember my father and I used to quail hunt up in Holmes and Carroll County in the hills when we were living in the Delta. And I remember jumping a deer one time. Our dog actually pointed a deer. We thought she was pointing quail. It was up in a little ravine that had a lot of brush in it on the side of a hill. And our dog had pointed, and we were easing up there, getting ready to flush him. And all of a sudden, a big old buck comes bounding out of that brush.
Wow.
And my father, of course, wouldn't let me take a shot at him because he didn't want anything killed but quail in front of his dog. not that I would have hit it. I think that buck was pretty safe for me, especially with number 8 shot
and on the run.
But
funny.
Deer were rare back then, and so I was always envious those people who got to deer hunt, and they would come back with all these stories about these things they had seen. Probably half of it wasn't true. But especially they used to talk about wolves, which I'm sure they were seeing coyotes at the time.
Right.
And nobody knew what a coyote was back then in Mississippi. They called them wolves. But anyway, in Leland, I would hear these stories about Teddy Roosevelt hunting in Mississippi. And to hear people talk, it was like he came down here every other week to go bear hunting,
Yeah.
And I just sort of forgot about that. Years went by. And we always had outdoor magazines around the house. My father always subscribed to Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, and Sports Afield. And so I was always interested in that sort of thing, always reading those magazines, and always thought I'd like to be an outdoor writer one day. But, life goes on, and I got married, and my wife and I ended up in Oxford. And I was actually working for Ole Miss. And I heard about this I read an article in Field and Stream about a guy named James Gordon who had lived in Pontotoc, who had been an outdoor writer after the Civil War. He'd written these bear stories. So I started looking for his bear stories. And I was also had heard about Holt Collier at the time, and I was doing some research on him. But I started getting these bound volumes of old outdoor magazines through interlibrary loan. And I would just leaf through them. I'm talking about magazines from the 1870s and 1880s.
Wow.
And I would just leaf through them, and wherever I saw anything about Mississippi, I would copy it, photocopy it, Xerox it, and file it away. And I'm glad I did that, because one of those magazines, you can't get that way anymore. You have to look at it. You have to find it either in hard copy at a library and go to that library. I'm glad they're not sending these out in interlibrary loan now, because they're too delicate, but it makes it hard to see them now. I think the one I'm talking about, sport, is the American Field, and it's on digital. There's a digital format of it, but only about 11 libraries in the country carry it, so it's hard to research in that magazine.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's kind of how I got started gathering all the material. I sort of filed that away too, and years went by, and I always wanted to write some kind of book on these bear hunters, and I thought about various approaches, and then I came on some more material on Bobo, and I realized I had enough on Bobo to be the core of a book, and so that's what I did. I started writing the Bobo book back, I guess, around 15 years ago, and it took me a number of years to get it ready to go. I had no idea how to write a book, and I just sort of had to put it together as I was, roll it as I was going,
Yeah, sure.
And but it turned out all right, I think.
There it is, The Bear Hunter, The Life and Times of Robert Eager Bobo in the Cane Brakes of the Old South. Is that? I mean, that's his actual picture there.
That's his picture. That photograph is the only portrait I know of him. It was shot in a studio in Memphis.
Okay.
And somebody prevailed upon him to do it. He had a good friend in Memphis named Tom Devine. And Bobo was arguably the most famous bear hunter of the late 1800s in the United States.
Okay.
Anybody who read the outdoor magazines in those times knew who Bobo was.
They knew who he was.
His articles about him would pop up in newspapers. They'd have a little article blurb that said, Colonel Bobo. He might be called Colonel sometimes. He might be called Major sometimes. There's always some military title, although he never was an officer in the military. It was just a custom. But he was very well known around the country in those days by outdoorsmen. But he had this friend in Memphis named Tom Devine who worked for the railroad. And the railroads back then were always trying to promote hunting and fishing because back then you had to take the train if you were going hunting or fishing.
Okay.
So Devine asked Bobo to come up to Memphis to meet his writer friend from Chicago, a fellow named Emerson Huff. And Huff was kind of like me. He was a lawyer turned writer. And although he was far more successful as a writer than I was when I was writing my magazine material, he was working in the Chicago office of Forest and Stream magazine, which eventually was merged into Field and Stream.
Okay.
And anyway, Devine got Bobo and Huff, Emerson Huff was this man's name, got them together in Memphis. And Huff had planned a trip down south. He was going quail hunting in West Tennessee. He was going duck hunting down in the marshes around New Orleans. And then I think he was going duck hunting again over in East Texas somewhere. And Devine said, you need to go bear hunting while you're here, down with my friend Bob Bobo in Mississippi. And so they agreed on a hunt, and Huff came down in the fall of 1894, and Bobo took him hunting, and he went home and wrote like a 5-part series on his hunts with Bobo. And that's how Bobo really became well known. And then the next year he did the same thing again because Huff didn't get a bear on that trip.
Okay.
Everybody but Huff got one. Okay. Huff didn't get one. But the next year Huff came back and hunted again and did another series on Bobo. So Bobo's extremely well known.
And, I haven't read it, and I'm going to. Chip gave me a copy here of the book. But without giving too much away, I'm just curious, will I read about the actual hunt, the techniques they used, and kind of how the hunts went themselves?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really think this book, it may be the only book that really thoroughly describes the bear hunting culture of the Delta.
Okay.
I've got a chapter a lot of people told me they really love on the Delta of that time that describes what it was like, what it looked like. The tremendous size of the trees. Oak trees, 5 feet through the middle. Yellow poplar and sycamore, 8, 10, even 12 feet in diameter.
Good grief.
Park-like beneath these trees. It was grassy, not a lot of undergrowth because, that land was Indian land, Choctaw and Chickasaw land, the Delta was until the 1830s. And they generally burned off the woods back in those days. And I think a lot of the early pioneers did too. They would burn it off. Plus they had overflows from the river that would keep the brush down too. Would flood out the woods every year. So you had all this grassy area, and then you had these large areas where a tornado had gone through, or there had been a fire, usually on the higher ground in the Delta. When something like that happened, cane would grow up. And those were the things they call cane breaks.
Okay.
And these things were huge. Sometimes there was one over near where Parchment Penitentiary is now. In fact, Bobo hunted over around there. It was like 15 miles long and 5 miles wide at places. And it was just cane, broken trees, blackberry, greenbrier, all kinds of brush in there, impenetrable. And when pressed, the bears would run into that and hide, into those places.
When you say cane, is it like sugar cane? Or?
No, cane. It's river cane is one name for it. It's also called giant cane. The scientific name is Arundinaria gigantea.
What does it look like? Because I guess I'm
It looks like a fishing pole,
Kind of like
bamboo.
Like bamboo. That's what I was.
Okay.
It looks a lot like bamboo. See, that's the thing.
That's what I was imagining in my head. Yeah.
That's the interesting thing. Now, back then, everybody knew what cane looked like, and now you see it on the side of the roads where it grows. The bamboo you see in thickets, because bamboo's invasive here. It's everywhere.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can't root it out of your yard. If I had some in my backyard at a house I lived in once, and it was just awful.
It just keeps coming up.
Yeah. But that stuff is real green. This river cane is green and kind of yellowish. And unlike the bamboo, they're both the same type of plant. They're both members of the grass family. And that's why they need a higher ground, because they don't tolerate flooding well. And they need sunlight. So that's why when a tornado went through and knocked the trees down, the cane would come.
Okay.
But the river cane, the native cane we have here, it's hard to get a start. It's unlike that bamboo. It's really hard to get started. In fact, there's a lot of projects going on in different parts of the South where like university scientists are trying to get cane regrowing. But it was everywhere back then. And the reason we don't have so much of it now is because it was on the higher ground in the Delta. And so that's the first place when people went in looking for land, after the Choctaw and Chickasaw sessions, when the Delta was opened up and people went in looking for land, they looked for cane breaks because they knew it wouldn't flood.
Okay.
When the rivers overflowed, it would be the high ground. And so they would go in there, burn it off, clear it off, and farm. Okay. Also, it's probably, the cane leaves a really good soil. So
okay. That makes total sense now.
It was the first land cleared. The cane breaks were.
Those session, that Chickasaw session in the 1830s, where then all that Chickasaw and Choctaw land began to be divided up. That's where we get all our counties, and
exactly.
Those popped up for the first time. And so we're getting a history lesson here, but what you're saying is what we think of as the Delta, the flat farming Delta, was that was some of the latter.
It was the last part of the state that was settled.
Okay.
It was the last part of the state that was settled because, primarily because of the floods. It flooded almost every year at least once, sometimes twice. And, it flooded in the late winter. There was no real good levee system back then. From the time of the earliest settlement over there, they were building some levees. I mean, I can remember as a boy going, when we lived in Clarksdale, going out to, there's a huge sandbar right around up above Friars Point, and my father and some of his friends used to goose hunt out there. And I remember going out with Daddy to where they goose hunted one time, and walking out there, we crossed one of those old levees. It was about 12 feet high, whereas the new ones are like 30 feet high.
Right.
But and there's still a lot of those places, a lot of places up there you can see those old levees between the new levee and the river. But they weren't very good, and they didn't hold well, and they didn't have them all up and down the river. And the levees didn't really start having a good levee system until the first levees were probably built, the really good ones were probably built in the 1880s and 1890s. And once they did that, the railroad started coming through the Delta, and then they started cutting the timber, hauling it out. I mean, they were cutting it before then, but that's when they really started clearing it up on a wholesale basis.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing, though, about the levees, the father of modern levee building was a guy named Thomas Dabney. And he was an outdoor writer, too. He wrote under the pen name Coahoma. And he wrote the first article I've been able to find in a national magazine about Bob Bobo, the bear hunter.
How about that?
He sort of got the national press interested in Bobo.
Under the pen name Coahoma.
Right. And like I said, his name was real name was Thomas Dabney.
Spelled the same as Coahoma County.
Yeah.
Now that's cool.
Yeah.
What they say, an interesting web we weave there over the span of history. Okay, and so that's the bear hunter. How was it received when you?
Oh, I've sold the first printings I did were hardback.
Okay,
and they sold out the hardback. I did three hardback runs. Of course, I'm a self-publisher, so I did two. I think I did one 1,000 copy run, one 750 copy run, one 500 copy run. But that's a lot of books. I mean, a lot of publishing company books don't sell that many. It's not a huge sale, but for a self-publisher, it's not bad. And it was received well. And then I put it in paperback just because I didn't want to feel like laying out that money at this point on doing another hardback run. And it sells in bookstores. All of my the three books you have now before you, they all sell in bookstores in like Lemuria here in Jackson, Square Books in Oxford, Cotton Row in Cleveland, Lorelei in Vicksburg, Square Books in Oxford, Novel in Memphis.
Okay.
And then you can get it on Amazon, but I always encourage people to go to their local bookstores.
Well, and I was thinking, so it must have been a good experience because you didn't stop there.
No, I didn't. I didn't.
So was the next one?
The next one's the Hunting Bear and Panther in the
Hunting Bear and Panther in the Old South. And Jim, okay, so I sort of lit up when I saw the title of this book, Hunting Bear and Panther in the Old South.
Panther's the magic word.
That's the magic word because I'm telling you, even on a sports radio show, we're supposed to be talking football, but it could be the off season, maybe in the summer, and it's a slow day. And if I just want to stoke the fire, all I have to do is ask the question, do we have Panthers in Mississippi? And then here we go, mid conversation on that. There it is, right there, the title.
People will fight over this subject.
Well, what did you find?
First of all, let me tell you about that little book. It's, the title might be a little bit misleading, but it's the best I could do.
Okay.
What that book is a collection of 4 long articles by a Dr. Henry J. Peck. He was born in 1802 in Massachusetts, moved to Natchez, Mississippi in the 1830s, married a woman whose family owned a sizable plantation over in Catahoula Parish, Louisiana, across the river, around Sicily Island, right north of Sicily Island, on Sicily Island. Actually, I think it is. My geography is not that great over there. But anyway, Dr. Peck was quite a naturalist and quite a hunter. And he was working on a book that was supposed to be about a lot of different animals.
Okay.
But the only articles that I can find of his, and probably the only ones that survived, they may be the only ones he wrote. But there's one on bear hunting, one on deer hunting, one on hog hunting, which is interesting because it's so similar to the way hogs are hunted today.
Okay.
And then one on panther hunting. And his article on panther hunting is particularly interesting because he calls it tiger hunting.
Really?
Because they called, in parts of Louisiana, the panther was called tiger.
Okay.
Which is probably where we get LSU Tigers.
Okay.
I know what's that?
So, interesting.
Yeah, the LSU Tigers actually were probably named for the Civil War regiment,
right.
LSU Tigers.
Yeah.
But I think the Louisiana Tigers, but I think the Louisiana Tigers probably took their name from the Louisiana Tiger, the Panther. Mm-hmm. It's possible they had jaguars in Louisiana at some point, which are, of course, are called tigers in Mexico, tigre. But Dr. Peck clearly is talking. In fact, he says it's the cougar. You know,
okay.
He says it's the same thing as a cougar or panther.
Okay.
And that's But anyway, his article on the panther hunting is pretty good. He talks about a couple of instances of people being attacked by them. And what I did a biographical introduction on Dr. Peck. I found out everything I could about Dr. Peck and then wrote a brief, 20-page biography of him, and then heavily footnoted these articles. And a couple of I also found a couple of things that weren't outdoor related that I put in appendices to the book. But I footnoted so a lot of people might not know some of the terms that he used. Like, for instance, I think he talks about shooting buck and ball out of at game, and a lot of people today might not know what that is.
But if you've studied Civil War history, or you've ever gone, relic hunting, or gone to a relic show, you know what buck and ball is.
Yeah, it's a round ball that fits the size of the barrel of a smoothbore gun with 3 buckshot on top of it, typically.
Yeah. I've found, metal detecting and elsewhere throughout the state, the buck. And a lot of times you'll see the 3 indentions from where the ball, where the 3 inches of the buck were rammed on top of it, and those kinds of things. Okay.
That's
so Panther, Louisiana, but Mississippi also?
Yeah. Well, of course, in my Bobo book, there's a chapter where he talks about, where I discussed Panthers a little bit.
Okay.
The Bobo book, if I can go back to that for a minute, the way I did that, I took Emerson Huff's narrative. Using that, I kind of put that in my own words, but I also would bring in other things. Like, for instance, when Bobo was scouting for his land, Bobo was a Civil War veteran. He ran away and joined the Confederate outfit when he was 16 years old.
Yeah. Okay.
He came back from the war. His family had moved here from South Carolina before the war, like as my family did, moved to South Carolina back in the 1830s. But they were poor. They didn't really have anything. And so after the war, Bobo gets in his canoe with a friend, and during the overflow, when the river's up, and they go looking for land, like I was telling you about. They're looking for high ground. Mm-hmm. And they were doing it for 2 reasons. They wanted some land they could use as farmland, and they were also looking, that's where the deer and the bear would go when the water was high. Mm-hmm. And so that's how Bobo found his plantation land after the Civil War. It's between Moon Lake and the town of Bobo today. But not Moon Lake, excuse me. I said Moon Lake. DeSoto Lake. South part of the county. And it's along, in fact, there's a road that runs through there on what is called Annis Ridge. And that's where a lot of Bobo's land was. And his family still owns most of that land, I think, if not all of it. But anyway, that's when I'm talking about him using the canoe, I do a little discussion on the canoes they use, because everybody had one because of the overflow, and I found a great article telling how they made them. You know, the way they would make the dugouts. You know,
isn't that cool?
So anyway, that's what I do. But back to the Panther. There's a chapter on Panther in there. I have one chapter where they're sitting around the fire after a hunt one day with Huff, and they are talking about various things. They talk about panthers. They talk about wolves. You know,
Fascinating. So that was number 2. Hunting bear and panther in the Old South.
If I can tell you something, one of my favorite passages in that book is actually the deer hunting section.
Okay.
I call it hunting bear and panther because those are the more exciting animals from a modern perspective, I think. And I couldn't say hunting bear, panther, hogs, and deer. That's a little too long.
Too long.
So, but the deer chapter has a great description of what they called fire hunting.
Okay.
And back in these old outdoor articles, you see frequent references to fire hunting. And I had a somewhat idea of what it was. Basically what it was an 1800s version of headlining deer.
Okay.
They would take pine knots and they would put them in a basically a big old skillet, like a big frying pan. And they would attach a pole to the handle of the pan about 6 or 8 feet long. They would light the pine knots, hold the pole over their shoulder with the pine knots burning behind them, so they wouldn't be burning, messing with their vision. They would be able to look into the dark with the fire behind them, And they would tilt the pan up on their shoulder, walk through woods, or sometimes they'd be riding a horse. And if they did, they had to put a blanket over the horse because sparks would come off the fire, and they didn't want the horse getting burned and bucking them, So they would go through the woods that way with the pine knots burning, and they would shine deer. And with something as simple as a pine knot fire, they could see deer 60, 70 yards away sometimes at night.
Similar to, seeing a head pop up and seeing eyes and spotlight.
And he's got a great description. Actually, it might have been another article, another story I read where they described how to tell the different types of eyes, to see at night.
Wow.
So, but I did come across one guy that shot a cow when he was
by mistake.
That's a book I'm working on right now. This book I'm working on right now haven't published it yet, but it's a lot of fun.
Okay.
It's about a guy who was a school teacher up in North Mississippi, and then this is the 1840s, and then he moved to Arkansas. But he was just writing in his diary one day about how disgusted he was because he had gone out. He had lost the barred mule he was on, and he had shot a cow. That's a bad night.
That's a bad night. It almost sounds like a Jerry Clower joke in there somewhere,
That's going to cost him a lot of money. That night's going to cost him a lot of money.
Yeah, I bet. That's great. I look forward to reading that. And then the third here in the stack, and this was chronologically the third one, 2023, Bird Dog Man. The story of W.W. Titus, father of the National Bird Dog Championship field trials. Yes. Now, again, you must be having good experiences because now we're on to a third one in this.
That amazing. The little book, Hunting Bear and Panther in the Old South, has just continues to sell quite well. I think one reason it's little and it's cheap. It's a little cheaper than a lot of the other ones, but it's an interesting book. But the Bird Dog Man, it says 2023. I actually had some printing problems, so it didn't really get out till like March of 2024. But I came across a set of articles, another one of these series of articles, years ago when I was working up at Ole Miss back in the 1980s. And I told you I would look for stuff about bears in Mississippi. Well, I came across a picture of a bear with 2 dogs after it. And I looked and I realized it was in the South. And I didn't read much about it. I saw that it was by a guy who was writing mainly about bird hunting. And I just thought, well, I'll go ahead and copy these. And I did, and I filed them away and didn't even think about them. I never even read them all the way through. I just copied them, filed them. And when I went to work on the Bobo book, I got to thinking about that picture, that little drawing in that magazine article of the bear with the two dogs after it. And I said, well, I'll go see if there's anything in there I can use in this book. And actually there was a pretty good little story. It didn't take place in Mississippi. It took place down in either southern Georgia or North Florida. It was hard to tell, but it was about these two dogs these guys had that were basically mongrels, but they were fine bird dogs. They were really top flight bird dogs. And but they loved to hunt. They would go out with the foxhounds. They would go out with the rabbit dogs. You know, anytime they could go hunting, they go hunting. And one day they were out and they jumped. You know, like I told you, our bird dog pointed a deer.
Yeah.
Well, the dogs jumped a bear when they were out hunting. And these bird dogs, they rushed in where wise men fear to tread. You know, they just charged in and jumped on that bear. And it's a story about what happened to them, how they survived. They survived it. But at any rate, didn't mean to get off on that rabbit trail. Right. But I dragged those articles out and started reading them. And I realized what I had was W.W. Titus, who was a bird dog trainer. I had his memoirs. He had serialized for the American Field in a 5-part series. And they stopped about, I think it was 1888 where this series stopped. It told about it starts with him as like a teenager, and then stops, and he was born in 1857.
Okay.
And then stops in 1888. And I thought, this is such a good piece of writing. It had a lot about Mississippi in it.
Okay.
Which I'll explain in a second. I said, this is such a good piece of writing. I need to figure out something I could do with this. And so after I finished the Honey Bear and Panther in the Old South, I'm real bad about getting off on one project and deciding, I don't really want to do this right now, and then I'll jump to another one. I'm bad about not following through. But I thought I wanted something I could get out fairly quickly, and I thought this was the project, the Titus book. It turned out to be not so quick, because the more I got into it, the more I realized there was. Titus was a really fascinating fellow. He was born on Long Island, New York in 1857, grew up there. He, due to a horrible accident that killed his mother, a fire in their house, he ended up going to live with the relatives in Massachusetts until he was a little older, came back to Long Island. He and his brother got in the dog training business. And back then, people bird hunted on Long Island, New York. I was just up in New York a week and a half ago because my youngest child was graduating from a conservatory she was attending up there. And I can tell you, there's not any bird hunting down on Long Island today.
Not anymore.
But there was back then, and wealthy men who lived in New York would hire Titus and his brother to train their dogs and to board their dogs out on Long Island. Then they would come out there and hunt with them. So they had the field trials were just cranking up in the 1870s. Okay. In fact, the first one was held in 1874 in Memphis, Tennessee. The first North American field trial was held up there. And it soon caught on as a sport. And they had the Eastern field trials on Long Island in 1880. And a man from Pontotoc, Mississippi, James Gordon, I mentioned him earlier. I said that he was the one that wrote the bear hunting stories that I was interested in. Well, James Gordon and his cousin by marriage, Dr. Rollins Young from Corinth, Mississippi, were some of the first field trial judges. And so they were at the Eastern field trials. And Titus met Gordon there, and Gordon said, the quail hunting, they could quail hunt on Long Island, but it wasn't very good.
Okay.
And so Gordon told him, man, you need to come down here and I'll show you some real bird hunting. So Titus packed up first he went down. The main reason he left was because they had a real bad winter up there, and he couldn't train his dogs. And he came down to North Carolina, and it was bad there too. So that's how he ended up down in Florida, where I told you the story about the bird dogs and the bear. But in the very early 1880s, he goes to Cherry Creek, Mississippi, which is approximately where Ecru is in Pontotoc County now.
There's a Cherry Creek orchard right around there now. It kind of marks where that
That's
area.
That's old town site, and they merged into Ecru. I think when the railroad came through. Ecru. And at any rate, he came down there, and the first winter he was there, he killed so many birds. He was just amazed. And he said the next year, what he would do, he would come down. He wasn't living there permanently yet. He would come down and spend the winter there and train his dogs down there. Then he moved permanently.
Okay.
But the second winter he was there, he decided he would keep a tally of how many birds he killed. And at the end of the year, he was amazed and embarrassed that he had killed 1,700 quail.
Good heavens.
1,700 quail. And he would give them to farmers. I mean, he didn't waste them. He'd give them to farmers and eat them himself, and people were happy to have them. But after that, he made a point of not shooting so much. He said it really wasn't good for the dogs to shoot that much. But Titus was very active in the early field trials. They would train their dogs, and a lot of Northerners would come down here to train their dogs in the fall and in the winter, and then on quail here. And then they would go up to the northern prairies and train them on prairie chickens in the late summer. Okay. And that was the routine he went through.
And I guess they were traveling from those northern parts of the country to places like Mississippi on trains with their dogs.
They were, and a lot of times, they'd go places where they didn't have trains, so they'd be in a wagon. Or like when he came to Cherry Creek, he took a stagecoach from Tupelo.
Okay.
And the dogs ran along beside the stagecoach.
Okay.
They let the dogs out, and they followed the stagecoach. But he took a stagecoach from Cherry Creek to Tupelo. That was in the early 1880s. And about in the late 1880s, Titus started seeing among the dog trainers, they always want to know whose dog's the best, whose dog's the best. And he started seeing this need for what he called a champion stake, a championship contest. Yeah. And a lot of people were running what they call championship contest, where in order to enter it, you had to have won another field trial. But he said, no, we need something nationwide that will be undisputed. And so finally, I believe, all the dates run together now, but I think it's about 1893, 94, at a meeting of some bird hunters up in field trial men up in North Carolina. They organized what they call the National Field Trial Championship Association, or U.S. Field Trial Championship Association, I believe is what it was called. They held the first national championship in 1894 at West Point, Mississippi. Okay, Titus was living in West Point.
Okay.
That was his headquarters.
Okay.
And they held the first national championship there. They were going to hold the second one there the next year, but they had a blizzard in West Point, Mississippi, and couldn't do it. And so they didn't have it at all that year. The next year, they had it either there or New Albany. I can't remember sure. I can't remember whether there was one big meet they had about the time in New Albany. I think it was the championship. Then the year after that, they were coming back to West Point, and they were going to have the championship there again. But this time there was a smallpox outbreak.
Oh, goodness.
West Point. So they moved it up near Grand Junction, Tennessee.
Okay.
And everybody liked the facilities up there. They didn't do it. I don't know if they did it every year there after that, but eventually it became the permanent home for the championship. And so that's where everybody thinks of the National Field Trial Championships. Now they think Grand Junction,
But it all really goes back to this man.
And started in West Point, Mississippi.
And West Point, Mississippi.
Right. West Point, Mississippi.
And Jim, as you're talking too, I hear these stories and about how you, for lack of a better term, kind of stumbled on his story initially and all. and how so many of these places track places that you've been in your life.
Yes.
Tupelo, where you were, born, Pontotoc right up the road from where you went to Ole Miss, and all, he'd have gone through Iuka to get to Grand Junction, Tennessee.
It's amazing to me. All the connections I have with these people.
Yeah.
Like the guy I mentioned earlier, James Gordon. I discovered not long ago, my father's grandfather on the McCafferty side was in the 2nd Mississippi Cavalry Regiment during the Civil War. Okay. I found out 3 years ago that James Gordon was his colonel. He was the colonel of the regiment, James Gordon.
Isn't that something?
And there was an old man in our church in Iuka named Brother Holder. He was a retired Methodist preacher. And in researching this guy, Gordon, I'm going to get a book out on Gordon eventually. I've written bunches of stuff on Gordon in preparation for this, but I just haven't gotten, it's a big project.
Yeah.
But this old preacher that used to sit down on the 2nd row when I was 6 years old in Iuka, he preached James Gordon's funeral.
My goodness.
I discovered that. So I have all these little things that cross like that.
That is, well, you can't help but hear that and start, again, connecting dots. And you can't help but do that and at least wonder, but at most just believe that there's a little divine intervention going in all of it also.
That's right. I think so. On Titus, the bird dog man, what I did with this book, I took his narrative that he did, his reminiscences of a dog trainer, I think is what he called it. And it was very incomplete. It had very little about his early life. Like I mentioned, his mother had died in the fire. He doesn't mention that. He just starts off with, he's in Massachusetts. He's in New England as a teenager. And then he goes directly from talking about how he liked to bird hunt, after school and when he was a boy to his career as a bird dog trainer. So there was a lot to fill in. And then he stops it in 1888. But his career really didn't peak until the 1900s, like 1901. So what I did, I filled in the gaps with my own writing and research. I used his writing where I could because it was such a good writer and such a good storyteller. His great stories about what it was like to hunt in the South and the Midwest in the late 1800s. And like the prairie chicken is endangered now over most of its former range. And when he was there, they were just in numbers so huge you can't imagine them. Like there'd be a covey of 100 birds, and the prairie chickens have this thing where they call it packing, which happens in late summer, I believe, where there might have been a couple of thousand of them in one field. They're just going through and they're just getting up everywhere.
Yeah.
And now it's hard to find a prairie chicken.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and you kind of are answering it without me asking you, but I will ask you anyway. So who are these books for? Who's going to get the biggest kick out of reading those books?
Oh, it's hard to say because like the bear hunter, for instance, I think there's so much Delta history in there that anyone with any interest in Delta history or just history in general would like it. In fact, a friend of mine told me his wife's book club was thinking about doing it.
Okay.
Their book club. This is a women's book club. Okay. And they're not hunting women.
Sure. Okay.
It's a women's book club. I don't know whether they did or not. That's what he told me they were looking at. Yeah. So I think the bear hunters got quite a range of appeal. In fact, a lot of people have told me that. The hunting bear and panther in the Old South, it's got a lot of historical interest. I think hunters mainly would like that, although I think anybody who's interested in history might like it. In fact, I've got an article appended to in one of the appendices of that book that Dr. Peck wrote about what became of the Natchez Indians after they were wiped out by the French down in Natchez and scattered to Louisiana. He's got quite an article about that because his plantation in Louisiana was called Battleground Plantation because the French were pursuing the Natchez over to Louisiana and they had a big battle there.
Wow.
Where his plantation was. You're talking about finding old balls and stuff, Sure. And he's found them all over his property.
Okay.
bird dog man, I think a lot of hunters would like that. A lot of people who like dogs would like it. A lot of people like history would like it. There's a great passage in there that has not, I said Titus was quite a good storyteller. One of my favorite parts in there is when he's telling about when he's taking one of his trips up to Iowa to go prairie chicken hunting. He takes the train over to Greenville, Mississippi, has to take a ferry across the river to Arkansas City from Greenville, and he describes in a little steam-powered, basically just open boat launch, and it's a great description of how the operator of the boat's not paying attention to the engine. He's talking too much, and he's afraid it's going to blow up because the pressure's getting too high. And then they go take the train from Arkansas City up to Little Rock, and the Pullman Railroad strike is going on. So he's got great descriptions of they got the troops out, to deal with the violence from the strikers and everything. It's just there's a lot of good history in there.
Yeah. And written, firsthand account too. I think you talking about who it appeals to. I think there's a lot of us and a lot of people who any historical perspective you can get your hands on where we got firsthand account written. It's a neat thing to read through that kind of. They were great storytellers, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, Titus really was. He saw things. He was a great observer, and he loved what he did. Yeah. So he wrote a lot about it. He writes a lot about the people he met in the bird dog field trials and about the dogs. He writes a lot about the dogs.
I get the impression that you love what you're doing too.
I do love this, and I love the research, particularly. The writing is hard work.
Yeah,
but I do love the reading, the research, and I like having done it. I like it when it's finished.
Sure.
But Titus, who would like that Titus book? One thing that's been gratifying to me is that I've had bird dog trainers read it and tell me how much they loved it. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing I was really worried about, because although I bird hunted with my father quite a bit as a child, I don't know that much about bird dog training and bird hunting. I never was a very good shot on quail. Managed to kill a few, but I never was a real good shot. But I had a young man tell me not long ago, he deer hunts and turkey hunts all the time. He said, "Man, I would trade 10 deer to be able to just shoot at a wild quail once."
How about that?
I said, "Well, my goodness, I haven't killed many big deer, but I sure have shot at some wild quail."
How about that? Yeah, and maybe, I had a football coach say one time, he said, everybody wants what they don't have.
Yeah.
I think about early 20th century, there weren't many deer. There was plenty of quail. Mm-hmm. And somebody then might have thought you'd be crazy to say that. There's plenty of quail. Yeah. I want to see a deer, but the populations kind of drive what we want to see.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's right.
Yeah,
because I go squirrel hunting sometimes. I call it squirrel hunting. I hardly even ever see a squirrel at this place. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So I'm crazy as a loon because I go to the same spot all the time squirrel hunting. Hardly ever see a squirrel.
I can identify with that for sure.
But I just like to get out in the woods,
Yeah.
And I drove up there one day, and it's where our park is on a pipeline right away. It's in a national forest between Macomb and Natchez. And I pull up on that pipeline right away. There's a lot of lespedeza planted in there. And I pulled up there one day, and quail jumped up in front of me. And I'd been at that same spot. I'd been down the woods one spring without a gun. I was just going out to see if I could hear a turkey or see one, And I was sitting out there, and I heard something I thought might be a deer. I heard something in the leaves. I said, "Is that a deer coming up?" And I waited. I never did see it. I was straining my eyes, and finally it was time to go. And I stood up. Quail jumped up right near that same. Must have been the same covey.
Right. Yeah.
Those are the only coveys I've seen of quail, and I don't know how long.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly neat then for those who've imagined those things, like the gentleman you talked about, to be able to pick up a book like this and read and sort of have a glimpse of what it used to be like.
Oh, I mean, even for me, like when I go quail hunting, my father was, he loved to quail hunt, but he was no expert at it either. You know, we had a pretty good dog, and we'd get, you know, if it was a good day, if we got a half a dozen coveys up, you know, where we hunted, and usually didn't get that many, 3 or 4. You know, they had a mark. You know, back then they'd name one. There'd be the graveyard covey, the schoolhouse covey, where the old school, you know, stuff like that. We had an old Corvair. We'd go from place to place to, you know, looking for those coveys.
Yeah.
And usually found them. But to think about a man having so many birds, they shoot 1,700 in a year.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then thinking, well, I'll back off a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, he said he felt bad about that.
Yeah.
He was ashamed that he'd killed so many birds.
Well, I am not ashamed that we have gotten a chance to talk to you about this today. It's a real treat. I can't wait to kind of dive in and do some reading on my own. And I know we've got people listening that are looking forward to it. And, you know, it's not only entertaining, but I think from a historical perspective, it's important. So thank you for the work that you've put into it.
Oh, listen, it's you know, I tell people, you know, the word amateur, we hear the word amateur today, we think it's somebody that does something in a kind of a slipshod way, or they're not really very good at it.
All right.
But the original meaning of that word had nothing to do with the skill level. It comes from the French and Latin, amo, you know, to love. Okay. It means an amateur is someone who does something out of love. And so I tell people that, you know, I hope I'm not an amateur when it comes to my skill and my writing ability, but I can guarantee you I'm an amateur of the subject when it means it's something I do because I love it.
Mm. That's great. Jim, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
I hope y'all enjoyed that. I certainly did. The Bird Dog Man, hunting bear and panther in the Old South, and the bear hunter. Get your hands on it if you can, with Mr. Jim McCafferty here on the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you outdoors.